I have the privilege of chairing this first afternoon session as well as being the commentator. It's always dangerous to combine these two roles, but I will endeavor to be conscientious. So our as you understand, each of those of us here at the table are allotted 20 minutes, and I'm to enforce that also upon myself. We have the three speakers that you see in your program. They are here as announced, and they will speak in the order they appear to my left, your right. So the first, Karen Rader. I look forward to hearing a presentation about museology, a field in which I spent many decades as a practitioner, rather oblivious to the more theoretical perspectives on the subject. So I welcome her presentation.
Thank you. So I think I'm after, I forgot to press the button. Can you hear me now? I think I'm after lunch because I'll talk about fun and museums and show you lots of pictures. So hopefully I'll fulfill that goal. But also I think I'm connected to the conference, so I feel like I want to talk a little bit because the case study is a little bit of an outlier in terms of some of the other papers. So I feel like I want to talk a little bit about connections to the meeting before I begin. So unlike the other people in this session, I'm not talking that much about scientists and their disciplinary work, doing experiments, educating graduate students, organizing. But like Olival, I'm talking about education and engagement. And in my case, I'm talking specifically why I asked that question about boundaries between sort of scientific and disciplinary expertise and public knowledge is because I think that's where this work that I'm going to present today plugs in through the lens of what would later come to be called informal education. And all of these things, public, scientific expertise, informal education as a term is a bit of a boundary object of the kind that we've all been talking about. So hopefully I hope to shed some light on that as well. The paper itself is cobbled together from a combination of excerpts from a book chapter. The book is a collaboration with historian of museums and science Victoria Kane. It's called Life on Display. It's about the shifting patterns of displaying biology and natural history throughout the 20th century, and also a conference paper that I delivered at the Humanities and Technology Workshop at UVA 2 years ago. So what I think this conference offers me a chance to do and to talk more about today is sort of the details of how informal education infrastructure gets born. And like some others, I see some continuities between the sort of interwar period and the Cold War period, but also connects to some dark matters themes. I would have thought we'd heard more jokes about dark matters than we have, so I cut a few. But global perspectives on the science-state relationship, education, and in particular education through federally sponsored structures like the NSF, is a kind of critically important way in which global perspectives on the science-state relationship get articulated. So why invest in informal education? Why at that time? Why museums? Secondly, the complex dynamics of knowledge and power. I think here I'm focusing particularly on Oppenheimer and what is or what should be the relationship between consumers and producers of scientific knowledge. This phrase, more democratic, what does that mean? And in what context and to whom? So I think trying to kind of unpack that. Last but not least, the cultural dimensions of scientific inquiry. I think, particularly through this last book, I've been embracing institutional history, which I know is kind of an outdated form, but I think it could use some reviving. And I think in particular, the institutional co-construction of what is science education, and what is a museum is kind of interesting here. And I retained the title, the Museums as Democratizing Technologies. I'm not wedded to that, but I sort of really trying to draw attention to the constructed nature of what is a museum and the ways that Oppenheimer is trying to unpack that. So let me speak briefly about the sort of history and prehistory of informal education. So David Uko of the NSF, who isn't no longer of the NSF, he's working for an educational consulting company, but he's written more kind of from an internal perspective about the NSF's relationship with informal science. It's always been a bit of a battle. Education in particular has been a battle within the NSF, but informal education in particular. In the wake of, so there have been those, John Rudolph, Audrey Wolfe, and also George Hine, who've written some about the NSF and education and kind of more formal curricular initiatives. In the wake of Sputnik, there was not only an investment in curriculum development, I think about which historians of education and science education have told us more, but also investments in teachers' institutes, which still persist today. So these are sort of training science teachers. And as early as the 1940s, even pre-NSF, the sort of movement within science education to do more hands-on. And arguably, you could push that as far back as nature study, right? And sort of the stuff that Sally Kolstad writes about. So there are versions of this. I don't mean to simplify it too much, but in the wake of Sputnik, there was this investment in teachers' institutes trying to get teachers doing more kind of hands-on activities. Of course, also at the same time that there's an investment in the public understanding of science, or PUO's program. So the funding climate for the term informal education dates to the 1980s. In the wake of the Reagan administration's budget cuts that resulted in the NSF Education Directorate being abolished, and great efforts on behalf of science teachers, the National Science Board and the Science and Engineering Education Directorate, that was born from that sort of budget crisis, that educational crisis within NSF. So at that time, when it was reestablished, the Division of Informal Science Education, the ISE program, was created. And even in the 30 or so years that that's been in existence, that's morphed several times. So right now, there is a cross-directorate initiative on research on learning in formal and informal settings. It's kind of interesting that the focus is back on research, so sort of evidence-based approaches to science education, but also the crossing of the divide between formal and informal education. So all of that is the 1980s. This is, I see, as a kind of prehistory to that. And so Oppenheimer is making interventions, kind of trying to push or construct some of these boundaries as early as the 1960s. So the first part of the story is sort of understanding why NSF and other organizations invested in him. So we had this, the short answer, before I talk about him and his biography, is that he had this combination of credibility within a kind of national scientific context, because he had worked on the Manhattan Project, but also because he was using these innovative methods that date back to his own biography, his progressive education at the Fieldston School, these methods that basically spoke to currents in international education reform. So we had, I forget which one of you this morning said, this combination of sort of national and international credibility that he could use. So this slide is meant to capture the various sides of Frank Oppenheimer, from physicist at University of Minnesota, who is, because of his communist associations, because he was run out of that before he could get tenure. And so luckily he came from a rich family where he could sell a Van Gogh painting and buy a cattle ranch and just go off and be a cattle rancher for a few years. So that's him doing that. Even out cattle ranching in the middle of nowhere, his reputation, people became aware of sort of who he was and what he did. So when they had a crisis of science teaching at the local school, the Pagosa Springs High School, And this is a picture from a yearbook at Pagosa Springs. He was called in to become a science teacher. So from university physics to cattle ranching to high school science teacher. So it was at that moment that he really, he'd had this kind of lifelong commitment to progressive education and hands-on education, and it goes back, his brother talks about him being the one that was more hands-on, much more willing to get dirty in the laboratory. But at the PTA meeting, the first year that he was there, he gave this pretty eloquent speech where he talked about trying to move the science curriculum beyond memorizing facts to what he called multiple proficiencies. And some of this language echoes language we hear now sort of in light of Bloom's taxonomy, but this was all kind of predating that. So rather than limiting students to traditional textbooks, he wanted to make what he called satisfying and fun learning by emphasizing how students could master some or all of the range of knowledge and skills that were required to do science. So he enumerated these: the manual dexterity of setting up and performing experiments, the manual dexterity of solving numerical problems, the technique of observing the results of an experiment. And he talks about how he sees that as enriching the student's individual life, so science is a way, sort of a component of a full liberal education, but also making them more useful scientists. So he hasn't left out the possibility that some of these people might become scientists, but he's also kind of trying to integrate science education for the non-scientists, for the layman, as well as for those who go on to graduate training. So in 1959, he found his way back into higher education, in part through, this is going to be my contribution to the alphabet soup, PSCC, the Physics Science Study Committee, which was a committee to develop curriculum in physics, by quoting from one of the participants, examining the fundamental processes involved in imparting to young students a sense of the substance and method in science. At the time that this study committee was meeting, there was a battle within science education, a tension that we talk about in the museum book between science literacy approaches, so sort of overall understanding scientific method, understanding scientific reasoning, and more disciplinary-based content. And I would argue that still today persists. For those of you who don't know, the American science education system is not federalized, although there's been a more recent attempt sponsored by the Gates Foundation called the Common Core Standards, which sort of standardize across states. It has not, it's very much still a regional, state-based affair. So anyway, these battles, all of that is just by way of saying that these battles that were being fought early on when he got into science curriculum are still being fought. He got further intrigued by hands-on pedagogy. And so he developed what were known as a library of experiments. These were what he called props, right, for learning science through hands-on activities. He saw that, and he even fought within the physics, the PSCC. He fought with some people about sort of to what extent was this necessary, and he held his ground. In part because, again, coming back to a speech he gave in a more international context, he's really seeing this boundary between expert and layman as one that needed to be bridged, right? So public understanding of science is necessary to bridge the gap between experts and laymen. Now, how do we do this? Given the kind of battles within schools, Oppenheimer saw museums as a kind of sideways way into the problem. And he was inspired in part, I talk a little bit in the paper, and I need to learn more about this, about the UNESCO resolution concerning the effectiveness of museums. This was part, it's hard to escape the alphabet soup. The International Commission on Museums, right? Collaborating to make museums a sort of more widespread and accessible way for education more broadly, not just in science. Frank Oppenheimer saw science as taught through museums as a possibility, a way to use this hands-on prop-based approach. So the idea was to recreate a laboratory atmosphere, this is sort of quoting him now, where all kinds of people could become familiar with science and technology and gain an understanding by controlling its props. So it's this combination of the physical materials and the manual labor, sort of hands-on, crucial to understanding public understanding of the field. So he gave another speech in which he talked about, he said, explaining science and technology without props can resemble an attempt to tell what it is like to swim without ever letting a person near the water, right? You sort of have to immerse yourself in that method. So the Exploratorium became an answer to that. It had links through the past. The siting of it was at the Palace of Fine Arts, which was a sort of international exposition site. But this is the interior of the building that he inherited. And you can see it's kind of open, right? It doesn't look like a standard museum with galleries and side halls, right? Why San Francisco? So California, a center of major universities, high-tech industry, scientific expertise, so educational resources, money. Most people talk about how Frank at least feigned innocence to, and I'll just say Frank not to go against the tradition of saying Oppenheimer, but just so you don't think I'm talking about Robert. Frank was innocent, generally speaking, or feigned innocence with regard to these kind of pop culture trends. But as you can see, this is a San Francisco Chronicle pop culture reporter, Peter Hartlaub, who was a child, right, and went to the Exploratorium. And obviously the people that were coming there were seeing the broader connections, right, to the sort of psychedelic anti-authoritarian counterculture that was going on in San Francisco. So how was it? So I'm going to move now to kind of how the Exploratorium articulated its model of science education in theory and in practice. So really two values framing the institution. And again, this is why I think he was so successful within the federal funding for science education. It was free choice learning, which did go against the grain, and content-driven pedagogy. So you can see from kind of the picture of walking inside, most museums, they sort of direct you through the flow, the architectural flow of the halls and the galleries. This is just a completely open space. It's numbered, so there are areas, but you're allowed to walk through the space however you want to walk through the space. This nonlinear arrangement gave visitors complete free choice about how to move. He repeatedly talked to his staff about not making visitors behave, that feeling like you're not going through in the right order or you're doing the exhibit wrong, but rather creating a space that relieves the visitor of any obligations. So one of his famous phrases that gets repeated again is, you can't fail a museum, or you shouldn't feel like you failed a museum, right? So he argued within this kind of broader context of redefining museums, he argued that the experience of learning science should reflect one common epistemological truth about the human experience of learning, namely that people learn more if they approach learning not as a chore to be accomplished, but, and again, now I'm quoting from him, as a sightseer on a wandering journey with opportunities to explore unexpected and pleasant nooks along the way. There were rules. One of them was no dioramas. But the no dioramas rule was not so much related to framing the space as it was to the fact that he didn't feel like they embodied any kind of content-driven. They were too expensive, they were too permanent, they were too static, they couldn't be changed. All of this, he said, did not embody the kind of vision of scientific knowledge, the content of knowledge that he wanted to impart through the museum. So in order to focus this kind of very broad vision down, they decided early on to focus on perception, in particular visual perception. And I will share this, I don't know, do the online things work here? Maybe not. I'm afraid to click it because I don't want to get off. But there's a great picture, there's several great pictures of Frank Oppenheimer wandering through the galleries. If you think I over-exaggerate the chain smoking, you will see he has a cigarette in virtually every one of them. But perception. So the focus on perception was meant to narrow it, but also to do what another task that he saw as important, which was looking at sort of not embodying traditional disciplinary boundaries, but trying to find topics that cut across art, different branches within science, right? So in the case of perception, in particular, early on, it was physics and biology. He was trying to transverse. And so in the words of a philosopher of science and former Exploratorium employee Hilde Hein, He wanted to induce museum visitors to discover for themselves how visual perception takes place and how it is modified by experience. So you can see in the next few things I'm going to show, there were some things that were just quite literally, right? So this is an ant, and the field of vision meant to contrast with just looking at it, right, flat on. But then there were these other exhibits. So this is an exhibit known as the brine shrimp ballet. So these are organisms that are phototropic, and the way that the display works is that you walk up and it looks exactly like it looks here. There's a switch that the visitor can flip, right, on and off. And what it does is it switches the direction of the light. The light is coming from the top or the bottom, right? And in each one of the tubes, the little brine shrimp, right, go up, and because they follow the light. And so it has this kind of fluid, right, motion. So that's an example of one of the exhibits. Probably won't have time to talk about this later, but it drove the exhibit people crazy. Any of you who have had children go to a museum, right? So what did the children do? They flipped the thing on and off, and the creatures would get habituated, right? So they just wouldn't move. They would sit there. And they had to keep getting replaced. So this is like another one of the kind of logistical difficulties of doing hands-on experience. It's not just that the switch broke, but the animals got habituated. So, am I running late? Oh, 2 minutes. Oh. All right. So, I wanted to draw attention to this quote, right? So this is sort of how he's framing the dilemma, right? You're trying to impart knowledge, but you're also trying to impart a sense of the process. So this thing, how many frustrated people is one addict worth? And by addict, I don't think he meant the people who were walking in stoned, looking at the ant, but sort of addicted to the process of knowledge, addicted to the kind of hands-on what's going to happen. And he always erred on the side of, we want the addicts, right? We don't want the people that just kind of absorb the knowledge and don't interact with it. It was very popular. It was popular with the public. It was popular. In particular, I talk about how it was more popular with university science educators than it was elementary teachers, and high school teachers loved it for themselves, but they were within kind of more strict curriculum constraints. So they struggled a bit to kind of get it absorbed into their curriculum. All of this, and I evoke the watchful grasshopper here for two reasons. One is that in museum history, Frank Oppenheimer is usually held up as this great success story, right? He reinvigorates the museum, he makes hands-on approaches, not just popular in science museums, but more broadly. But there were significant, what I would call, failures within this. And the watchful grasshopper is interesting in part because the effort to do biology, to do life sciences in a hands-on context has kind of logistical constraints, which I talk about in the paper. So if you couldn't picture it from the way I wrote about it, this is the watchful grasshopper. You can't see the grasshopper. It's on that little platform. And so the idea is that you walk in front of it, and this is sort of the micro hookup. It's there. It has electrodes inserted into its notochord that go off. You can see them because there's an oscilloscope moving, and you can also hear them because those are hooked up to the speakers. So I'll skip the part about logistical difficulties. This is what the actual grasshopper looked like. It's also interesting the way in which the public reacted to this, right? Because he and his exhibit designers assumed that this would be about the experiment, right, of moving your hand and being able to see, or moving some part of you and having the grasshopper watch you and you watch the grasshopper. But people who saw it, and I focus on this in part because there's a lot of archival correspondence, where he tries to explain to people, this is what this is about, and repeatedly people see sort of torturing animals, right, and the darker sides of science. I think this is, right, even when they're absorbing what is correct about the exhibit in terms of content, they're seeing it as an expression of violence, and there are others that I don't quote here. This is just Oppenheimer trying to respond back to them. So I think what's kind of interesting is that there is this pedagogical model. It's successful in many ways. It redefines the museum. It redefines informal science education. But it also invites questions that he didn't want to invite. Right? He wanted it to be more about kind of the ideology of science as a democratic method, politically democratic, right? If you follow the method, even given his own experience, where that clearly was not true, he was sort of peddling this kind of science as democratic access model, but he didn't want politics. He didn't want anything having to do with sort of animal rights or broader environmental concerns woven into the display, because he thought that that would invite a political discussion that he didn't think was productive. So there is this kind of boundary work of between what is productive ideology and what isn't for sciences that's embedded in his vision. And I'm sorry if I'm going over. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you want to move here?
Our next speaker is Olival Frere, whom I have had the pleasure of encountering various times in his migrations among continents. As you understand from his paper, he has devoted himself for some while to understanding the revival of interest in the foundations of quantum mechanics in the period after the Second World War.
Okay, thank you very much, the organizers, for inviting me to this conference, especially Alexei Kochevenikov, and thank you very much, Foreman. For me, it's an honor to have Foreman as a commentator, and a responsibility, as I told him in the beginning of this afternoon. So, my talk is part of a work in progress, and it is a wide project. I will just say a few words about this project to present an idea about how this talk may fit in this wide project. So the wide project is, in principle, a kind of a disciplinary history, or about how a subject may move from certain parts of the physics discipline to another part. To be more concrete, the problem I have been studying is how a certain subject, namely the research on the foundations of quantum mechanics, moved from a very marginal part of physics in the early 50s, 1950s. I would say almost a kind of a philosophical subject instead of a physics subject, to a very mainstream subject in physics in the middle of the 1980s, and then measuring with computer science in the 90s, it became a blossoming field of quantum information. So this is the broad question I am dealing with. I have been working on this a number of years, and nowadays I am preparing a book on this subject. For sure, the answers I have, there was no single factor to explain this move. I have a diversity of factors, and I am not discussing the details or even discussing this kind of details. What I want to relate is one of these factors with the broad theme of this conference, so Cold War times. There was clear evidence of connections between this research or this controversy on the quantum foundations and the early Cold War times, as in the early 50s, for instance, if you take the Soviet critics or Soviet criticism towards the complementarity interpretation, or on the opposite side, if you take, for instance, the career of David Bohm in the United States, and most of the debates in the early 50s, not only in the Soviet Union and in the United States, but also in countries, European countries like France, there was a strong interplay between the ideological tensions of the time and the research on foundations of quantum mechanics. Now, in this talk, I will speak on a different connections. I had a guess that I've never developed. I just suggested it in a previous paper, that in the late 60s and early 70s, the cultural and political unrest of the time helped to open the room, open space for the flourishing of the research on foundations of quantum mechanics. So this is my main focus on this question. In this talk, I will not speak about all the cases I have been studying. For instance, I have been studying how the magazine Physics Today opened its page to this kind of question. Now I will focus on a very specific case studies. The two Varena School held in 1970 and 1972, the first one on foundations of quantum mechanics, the second one on history of physics. While my subject is the relation of this school with foundations of quantum mechanics, I will speak just a few words about the second Varena School. Now, this is just an outline of my talk. For sure, I need to skip many steps in order to keep it the 20 minutes. First of all, I just say one word to tell you that I am not the first to think in this direction, so the connections between the cultural and political unrest of the late 60s and the early 70s and the content of science and the practice of science is something that you can find hints, for instance, in Hobsbawm, Kelly Moore, this paper by Alan Stubbs, a number of others. But in particular, I think that for my argument is very important the book by David Kaiser, How the Hip Saved Physics, because even if it is, the title is, in my opinion, an overstatement, and I do not like the cover of the book, but the book itself, it's a strong argument how a group of physicists around Berkeley in the early 70s were able to interfere and to force the research on the foundations of quantum mechanics. That's why, from my point of view, the book survives from the scholar point of view, because otherwise the book was criticized, would be criticized. Now, the Varena School. Just two words, Varena Summer School is one of the most traditional European summer schools in physics, which begin in the early 50s. Each year we have 3 different subjects, and a nice place to hold this conference. So I'm interested, the first one, in the 1970 Varena Summer School on Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. Let me say that this was a successful event, not only because it gathered almost almost 100 participants, but it was so the first contact I had with this conference, I was an undergraduate student, at the beginning of my graduate studies, and still in the late 90s, these proceedings was a reference for people who want to learn a little about the foundations of quantum mechanics. So a conference whose proceedings became a later reference, it's a good evidence of how important it was. But it was the first open space for debates on the Bell theorem and on the experiments on the Bell theorem. For people who are not aware, the Bell theorem is, and its experiments, it's the main result in this field of research. And some physicists consider one of the most important results in physics in the 20th century. In addition, there was a diversity of speakers, and it's my analysis that all these factors created an air of excitement around the research on foundations of quantum mechanics. So here it's Bernardo España and Toraldo de Francia. Bernardo España was the director of the school, and Toraldo de Francia was the president of the Italian Physical Society at the time, and they were key protagonists in this event. So here we have a photo, the program, the invitation for the formal dinner. Now, let me say that, first of all, this was not a regular physics summer school, because it dealt with a subject which was subject to strong and hot controversy among physicists. So, in order to have success in this school, the school required itself a number of diplomatic rules that D'Espagnat announced in the invitation letter of the school. And some of the attendees, like, for instance, André Barani, he told that for him, it was not even a school itself, because the senior physicists could not arrive to an agreement about what should be introduced to students. So he just said that from his later experience, this was more a conference than a school. Now, about the most important things I need to talk now. I had a number of physicists who attended this school. I sent a questionnaire to them, and a few of them I had interviews with them. And the idea that that school was fitted to the climate, to the political climate of the time, is something that I could find in different interpretations. For instance, Sabadini, this Italian physicist, he wrote to me that the sense of openness is something that spread from the street into academia. And Tito Toniet, he told me that at that time he had made an original thesis on Gold series, but he said that in the political context of that time, he hoped for a deep change, not only in society, but even the way of doing physics. And this was the way in which he changed towards foundation of quantum mechanics. Now, I have from at least three different sources strong indication that the decision to dedicate one of the Varenne school to this subject was kind of a political initiative of the Italian Physical Society in order to calm down the hot temperature, hot political temperature of the times. So I have the testimony, a recollection by Baraka, that at the time he was a student, and he was at the assembly of the Italian Physical Society, in which they suggested introduce a reflection on the foundations of physics, but not only on foundations of physics. The second topic was history of physics. Interesting that it was not history of physics for itself, but he said, quoting, that was considered a concrete way to study the social implications of science. So foundations of physics on one side, foundation of quantum mechanics, and on the other hand, social implications of science. I had an independent source, an interview I have done 10 years before with Franco Selleri, who was then a senior physicist, and he was moving to this field of research, and he said that it was him that suggested to who suggested to the Italian Physical Society this conference. And the third reference comes from the president of the Italian Physical Society, Toraldo di Francia, who was a very known physicist in the optical domain. So, from his point of view, supporting this kind of a school, he saved the Italian Physical Society because it was certainly risked being split in two at that time. The two, it's clear, the young physicists protesting against the war and so on, and the old and conservative physicists, like he said. Now, in the school itself, the school, it was a successful as a physics school, but the traces of the political background appeared in the recollections of the people who attended the school. It's interesting to see that, for instance, for the German tradition, politics was mainly a thing of the Italian physicists. This was the same impression of Zé, also a German physicist. Somebody told me that there were many communists, hence materialists, among the Italian organizers. Hence their problems with non-realism. Just a few words. For Franco's salary, realism was necessary, was compatible with his social concerns and political concerns. For the realism was no problem, but what is interesting is that both for the and for salary, this school was very important because it helped them to face institutional adversities to move to this field of research. We had a similar testimony from Anders Baran, and there was a nice incident at that school with Wigner. As you may have an idea, Wigner was clearly related to the American war in Vietnam, and but he was a kind of the dean of this subject because he was the most important physicist to give a lecture, the open lecture at this school. And so he wanted to throw a part on the 4th of July. And the students were against, because we could not have a part during the Vietnam War on 4th of July. And there were disputes, and in the end, the school was held. Now, about Wigner, about the climate of the school, I have a nice recollection by Tito Toniet, which shows us the mixture of the political ambience with the intellectual ambience, the cognitive ambience related to foundation of quantum physics. So he said that the intermingling of political and technical physics arguments was evident and palpable during these days in Varena. And he recorded that he had a direct discussion with Wigner at the dinner table about the best formalism for quantum mechanics, so it was a nice discussion, and then Wigner said that the students of the 6-8 movement must be mad. And Toniet replied, they must be clever, and the conversation was over. Now, I have 3 minutes. I will skip to the history of physics to say that this school also was influenced by this political background, not only in the dedication of the subject, but in this case, in the very ambience of the school. So, first one, it was also an important school. The director was Charlie Weiner, at the time the head of the Center of History of Physics. A number of historians of physics, John Bromberg, Gerald Holton, Martin Klein, some senior physicists, Dirac, Casimir, Weisskopf, Rosenfeld. There was an attempt to bring Thomas Kuhn and Paul Forman. Forman, as you know, hates traveling. And he did not go. I don't know exactly why. It's a compliment for the organizer of this conference to have Forman among us in Barcelona. So, it's true that compared to the school on foundations of quantum mechanics, one cannot say that this school was as important as the school on the foundation of quantum mechanics. But history of physics at the time was already a well-established field of research, which was not the case of foundations of quantum mechanics. And anyway, a school on history of physics organized by a professional society of physics was, and it is, still now, procedure not very usual. Now, this is the program of the school. Just to my final words, that school was held in the middle of a escalade of protests following the leak of the Pentagon Papers, in which the involvement of a number of important American physicists with the Vietnam War was made explicit through the GEHC project. So there were a number of unusual things, like Dick Gellman was prevented from talking at the Collège de France in Paris in June 1972, and other related events. Now, at the conference, so in this case, we have documents from these events, very nice documents, because we had this book, which was published in 1973 by Lévy-Leblond and Jobert, Autocritique de la Science. I have no time to enter into details. And this wonderful pamphlet, small book by Bruno Vitali, in which all the most important documents of the time were collected and published. It was a kind of a house publication because there was no official publisher. Now, at that school, it was approved. This statement, I don't go in the details of the statement. It was a statement against the Vietnam War, in which the relation with the GEHC program and the involvement of top-ranked American physicists, including Nobel Prize winners, with this war effort was the center of the criticism. Just to conclude, I will jump because I do not have time, but I will say that this statement had no common agreement with the senior physicists who were at the Varena school, but the reference to the statement survived because in the introduction, it was the first time I knew about this statement. In the introduction of the proceedings, Charles Weiner referred to this statement. So, to conclude, my conclusion is not very different from a number of other historians who had arrived to the conclusion that the sphere of politics does not necessarily is a prejudice against the practice of good science. In this case, I think that a bunch of physicists, young and not so young, exploited the political ambience of the time, which pushed for change in the science establishment, suggesting and organizing school which helped to foster the field of foundations of quantum theory, as well as the field of history of contemporary physics. Thank you very much.
Our third speaker is Slava Garovich, who began his life and completed his education in the Soviet Union and has worked, as you probably know, quite extensively on the history of cybernetics, a subject in which the Soviet Union had a strong interest. He is now in the United States, living in the Boston area. It is one of these characteristic features of international congresses that people who live quite close to one another and have never previously met are joined on another continent. And so I'm very happy to make Slava's acquaintance and look forward to renewing the acquaintance in Boston.
Thank you very much, Paul. I wish to thank the organizers, the National Committee, the International Committee, the Transnational Committee for bringing together this conference. When I got the invitation from Alexei and read the title, Dark Matters, I asked him, why such a gloomy title? He could have called it Light Years to indicate how easy it was to get funding for science, especially if you cater to military patterns. So what today I want to present is essentially, although you probably had a chance to take a look at the published paper, it's still very much a work in progress. It's my first take at a topic which is much larger than what's presented in the paper. It's a topic on social and cultural history of the mathematical community in the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 70s. And so there are several very important aspects to it, which I just touch upon in this paper, including discriminatory policies at Moscow State University, admissions policy at Moscow State University, the creation of a network of specialized mathematical schools. It's several separate topics which I just touch upon in this paper. This paper is maybe an attempt to give somewhat of an overview of what are interesting issues here in an attempt to develop an argument. And I would, welcome your comments and criticism because it's still very much in flux. One of the most important findings for me when I first approached this topic was to discover a whole kind of world of informal activities in mathematics that are not usually covered by traditional institutional histories. I discovered that there was much going on that is not reflected in archives and not reflected in any documented record. So I had to rely quite heavily on oral interviews, conducting over 60 interviews, and its oral history project still ongoing. You know, any mathematician who passes through Boston, I get a hold of him or her and interview them. So today, let's see. Okay. I'll talk about the post-war Soviet mathematics, specifically the years from mid-1950s through the end of the 1970s. And this is a period which is fondly remembered by mathematicians as a golden age of Soviet mathematics. We all know that golden ages usually have little to do with the actual achievements of the past and more to do with the frustrations and hopes of the present projected into the past. Yet, without idealizing this period, it's worth taking a look to see what's so remarkable about it that it's made it possible to construct its image in collective memory as a golden age. And usual explanations appeal to the popular image of mathematics as a kind of ideologically neutral activity that would be free from interference by the Soviet state, and they were therefore kind of attractive to people who tried to avoid ideological trouble. But if we look at the actual conditions in which Soviet mathematics was practiced, we find a very paradoxical situation. Soviet mathematics at that time could be best described as a restricted space. There were travel restrictions and general restrictions on contacts with the world community of mathematicians, restrictions on travel, limited access to foreign literature, obsessive secrecy regulations, pressure to submit articles to domestic journals instead of international ones. Citing foreign authors could be viewed as diminishing the contribution of Soviet mathematicians. Publishing in foreign journals required special permission and was often looked upon with suspicion as a sign of political disloyalty. Personal meetings were rare, since most Soviet mathematicians couldn't travel abroad. Occasionally foreigners would come to the Soviet Union, and once observing a rare instance of a live exchange with foreign scholars at an international conference, a leading Soviet mathematician privately remarked, "Of course, we live in a prison." Another type of restriction is kind of conceptual restriction, imposing a rigid curriculum. Although advanced by Western standards, the mathematics curriculum, even at leading Soviet institutions, was very rigid and emphasized technical skill over conceptual depth. Under the Soviet educational models, all students were put through the same obligatory sequence of courses, often outdated. Because of political and ethnic purges conducted among the faculty and the rigidity and conservatism of the educational system as a whole, a dramatic decline occurred in the quality of math teaching. Universities rarely, if ever, offered courses in new and booming research fields. The efforts to introduce new courses faced resistance. When one professor attempted to revise a 20-year-old course on analytical geometry at Moscow University, he was told that, quote, "one couldn't take a gear out of clockwork and replace it with a gear of different size," unquote. Political restrictions were in place. Despite the limitations of its curriculum, the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow University was still the best place to get mathematical education in the Soviet Union. But the admission policies to Moscow University, it varied at different times, but specifically with respect to mathematics in the early 1970s, the policies were changed to impose very rigid restrictions on who could or could not be admitted to the university. This followed the 1967 Arab-Israeli War and anti-Israel campaign in the Soviet media, which resulted in anti-Semitic policies by academic administrators, 1968 Soviet suppression of the Prague Spring, and subsequent protests by Soviet dissidents, and several widely advertised trials that followed these events, showing widespread dissent among the intelligentsia. And this engendered a severe crackdown on dissident activity in academic circles, including Moscow University, and a radical shift in admissions policies. So the access to the Department of Mechanics and Mathematics, admission to this department was severely limited for the, quote, undesirables, groups which included the Jews, students, suspected of political dissent, and sometimes, ironically, graduates of schools with advanced math instructions. Jewish applicants were usually separated from the rest, hoarded in one room, and subjected to a grueling procedure of systematic elimination. They were given so-called killer problems known as coffins, which far exceeded in difficulty the problems given to the other applicants. And according to many reports, the students were given these problems one after another until they failed one of them, at which point they were given a failing mark. So as a result, the undesirables were often consigned to second-tier educational institutions and effectively barred from graduate school. Administrative restrictions, because of the hierarchical structure of the Soviet Organization of Science and Education, power was concentrated in the hands of several directors of key institutions like the Institute of Mathematics of the Academy of Sciences or the Dean of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics. And the leadership of these institutions, either following hints or signals from above or motivated by personal hatred or anti-Semitic Jews, vigorously promoted their own supporters while placing barriers in the path of undesirables. And this kind of hierarchical structure allowed them to do that. Discriminatory hiring policies effectively excluded the undesirables from mathematical research organizations. Several world-ranked mathematicians had to work at non-academic institutions, pursuing pure mathematics as a hobby. Besides the strain on their time and finances, this also made it difficult for them to publish their results. Most scholarly journals in the Soviet Union required certification that a submitted article didn't contain classified or restricted information. So one had to obtain a clearance certificate at one's workplace, and it was very difficult to obtain a certification for a person who is not an employee of an institution officially designated to carry out research in pure mathematics. So they just couldn't obtain a permit to publish their article. And finally, there were even physical restrictions. Fences were built around significant research institutions, including Moscow University. This is a fence around Moscow University, which is still there, by the way. So in order to get into the building of Moscow University, one had to pass through a guarded gate, show ID, and if you didn't have an ID, you had to climb a fence, which some mathematicians had to do in order to get to some seminars held at Moscow University. So all these factors worked against the creation of a fully functional mathematical community. In other words, the conditions in which Soviet mathematics developed in this period looked like a recipe for disaster, not for a golden age. And Soviet mathematicians developed a number of strategies to overcome the restrictions faced by their community. And these efforts resulted in the formation of what I call a parallel social infrastructure, which existed apart from and in some sense in opposition to the official institutions. The Soviet Union had a long-standing tradition of math circles in which university students ran study groups with talented high school students going back to the 1930s. In the post-war period, the same model of volunteer instruction of talented students was extended to specialized math schools. In the early 1960s, several leading mathematicians and physicists made individual arrangements with school principals in major cities, with several principals, very few schools were part of that program, to open classes with advanced math instruction in mathematics and physics. Advanced classes in such schools were taught by undergraduate students. thus reducing the age and power differential between teachers and students, and facilitating an initiation of high school students into academic research culture. Math school graduates often return to their schools to teach, establishing continuity in the transmission of mathematical culture and helping form a closely knit community. University professors and undergraduates who taught at math schools were usually unpaid volunteers, and this left them a lot of freedom in shaping the curriculum. One such instructor called this voluntary teaching movement shadow pedagogy, which, similarly to shadow economy, functioned outside the sphere of official control. The relative autonomy of specialized schools made them attractive for non-orthodox and liberal thinkers. In one school, a geneticist persecuted by Lysenko was teaching biology. In another, a dissident singer-songwriter taught literature. In yet another, a dissident editor of a samizdat political journal was teaching history. As a result, the graduates of these schools were so different from the rest that they easily recognized each other at the university, in the university crowd. The independence of their thinking and the striving for intellectual freedom clearly set them apart from those in whom Soviet schooling inculcated conformity from an early age. That was, a reason why certain university administrators preferred not to admit students from specialized math schools. Since it was virtually impossible for the undesirables to obtain an academic position, a large pool of mathematical talent became available for employment elsewhere. Numerous applied mathematics institutes and computer centers obtained highly qualified researchers. Some institutions even created large centers of theoretical mathematics. The Institute of Problems of Information Transmission in Moscow, for example, set up a laboratory for, quote, complex information systems, unquote, which in fact led fundamental mathematical research. This laboratory employed a number of outstanding mathematicians, 3 of whom later received the prestigious Fields Medal. For comparison, only one mathematician from the Academic Institute of Mathematics received the medal. Various laboratories for mathematical biology and mathematical linguistics also provided employment opportunities for mathematicians. This phenomenon curiously mirrored the earlier efforts of Soviet geneticists to find a niche for their research outside the network of biological institutions controlled by the followers of Lysenko. The geneticists found such safe havens in physical and chemical institutions. Now mathematicians were able to find refuge in biological or linguistic institutions. Overcoming the rigidity of university curriculum, Moscow University professors and lecturers offered dozens of specialized seminars. They existed outside the regular curriculum. Attending them didn't bring students any credit. In fact, university students usually made up only part of the audience. Many participants came from outside the university, figuratively or literally climbing the fence. Foreign visitors and Soviet mathematicians returning from foreign trips were immediately asked to present at the seminar on the latest research trends. The system of open research seminars at which mathematicians presented their work in progress became a key component of the parallel social infrastructure. The most famous and influential of such seminars was a seminar led by Israel Gelfand at Moscow University continuously for 45 years, from 1945 until 1990. Run by Gelfand in a highly idiosyncratic manner, this seminar constituted an unusual semi-public, semi-private space. It was not limited by any institutional boundaries and attended by a wide range of practicing mathematicians, both from inside Moscow University and from outside, including independent scholars who were barred from professional employment by discriminatory policies. by ignoring the division between university and non-university mathematicians and practically forcing them to socialize, the Gelfand seminar created a social space lying outside the official institutional framework of Soviet mathematics. The unusual format of the seminar effectively undermined the administrative hierarchy entrenched in the Soviet academy. Gelfand could easily call any attendee to the front of the room and ask to restate some of the things that was said. Those in the audience who were unwilling to come up to the podium and restate the statements of the speaker would be asked whether they came to study or just be part of the furniture. And everyone was forced to think intensely about the matters discussed and be ready to explain them in their own words. Gelfand especially liked it when a junior member of the audience explained the idea more cogently and lucidly than the speaker, and he never missed a chance to point this out. He deliberately sacrificed the comfort and sometimes the dignity of the speaker to the task of achieving collective understanding. By pitting junior listeners against senior speakers, Gelfand effectively broke social hierarchies and made his seminar a place where only intellectual expertise mattered, and mathematicians of different social status could discuss problems on an equal footing. The Gelfand seminar attracted young talent because it offered participation in the closely knit community, which had its own internal mechanisms for building a scholarly reputation, independent of one's status in the Soviet institutional hierarchy. How am I doing time-wise?
You have another 3 minutes.
Okay. Although the seminar was public, Gelfand's idiosyncratic style made it essentially a semi-private matter in informal gatherings that broke social hierarchies and rigid rules of academic discourse, at the same time opening up space of intellectual autonomy. Under various political and institutional pressures, Soviet mathematicians increasingly shifted their work activities to informal settings. Instead of public spaces, mathematics was often practiced in private or semi-private spaces, in home kitchens, at summer dachas, during nature walks, at individual meetings with volunteer mentors, or at seminars which were not part of the formal educational system, such as the Gelfand seminar. Foreign visitors were first appalled by the Russian manner of holding academic meetings in private apartments, but they soon came to like it. The American mathematician Robert McPherson of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton has visited Moscow many times since the 1970s. He has recalled, quote, "There were no offices. People would gather over kitchen tables. These kitchen tables in Moscow are the warmest places I've ever seen. Maybe all afternoon you spend doing mathematics over the kitchen table, then it comes time for dinner, and then there is this amazing Russian feast. A good feeling is around and people are drinking vodka. Every apartment had a good kitchen table, and it was usually the only table in the house you could possibly do mathematics at, and that's where it was always done. It was a very social place, a very warm space. It was strange, of course, because at the same kitchen table where you would discuss mathematics, you couldn't discuss politics, because everybody assumed that there was some bug planted somewhere. Penalties were very strong for doing the wrong thing politically, but socially and mathematically, it was a paradise." Another private space commonly used for mathematical work was a dacha, which many senior mathematicians own or rented for the summer or the winter. I'm trying to sort of contrast the role of dacha in Soviet mathematics with what historian David Kaiser has dubbed the post-war suburbanization of American physics. With the rise of physics graduate school enrollments and growing employment of physicists in industrial research and the powerful appeal of consumer lifestyle, Kaiser observes physicists en masse moved to suburbs, becoming increasingly alienated from their colleagues. And senior American physicists often lamented the loss of friendliness, intimacy, and personal contact, accusing the younger generation of viewing physics merely as a 9-to-5 job rather than a calling. If an American suburb becomes a symbol of alienation and rampant consumerism, the Soviet dacha in the post-war period embodies the idea of escape from urban routine, the notion of freedom and a friendly company. Instead of being a refuge from work, for many Soviet mathematicians, the dacha became their primary working space, a place where they did their research, met with students, and exchanged ideas with colleagues. If the American feminists' motto in the 1970s was "the personal is political," the Soviet mathematicians made the mathematical personal. Many of them were not paid to do mathematical research. They often had to work other jobs. By devoting their free time to mathematics, they felt being part of a like-minded community and acquired a sense of self-worth. We might call this Dutchanization of Soviet mathematics, the emergence of a community dedicated to a mathematical way of life beyond any formal work duties or study requirements. For them, mathematics was a way of life, not very comfortable, but exciting and highly rewarding. Not in the sense of formal distinctions or institutional careers, but in the sense of hard-won recognition by their peers. And just a last conclusion, one paragraph. Although it would be difficult to draw a strict line between official institutions and this parallel social infrastructure, because there were many overlaps and intersections. The two systems sort of presupposed each other, almost like open economy and shadow economy in the Soviet Union. But in one sense, the line between the official establishment and the parallel social structures in Soviet mathematics was clear. The latter presupposed an alternative value system, a cultural environment in which mathematicians cultivated a group identity distinct from the officially declared Soviet values. Their position as outsiders fostered their sense of social and cultural exclusivity. With career paths effectively close to them, they didn't have much choice but to cultivate an idealistic ethos of detachment from material reward. They viewed the sublime world of mathematical thought not just as a refuge from harsh realities of Soviet life, but also as a foundation of shared identity with the world community of mathematicians. And when in 1978, at the World Congress of Mathematicians, the Fields Medal was awarded to a Soviet mathematician, Grigory Margulis, who came from this parallel social infrastructure and worked at Applied Mathematics Institute because he couldn't be employed at the academy. He was given that medal over the objection of the official Soviet representative in the Union. So ironically, this transnational identity emerged from the interplay of Cold War tensions, local institutional politics, and daily Soviet culture. Thank you.
I now take off my hat as chair and put on my hat as commentator. In approaching these three papers, my preconceptions, my preoccupations are with that epoch-making transformation, indeed inversion of the presuppositions from which our personal lives today proceed. That is, inversion from that era which our speakers have presented. Our lives means all our lives, globally, excepting only those who today remain enclosed or choose to enclose themselves in totalitarian systems of religious belief. That epoch-making transformation, as I say, to a great extent an inversion, is, as inversion, appropriately described as a transition from modernity to postmodernity. This is the frame shift that Susan Lindy referred to in our opening session, or that I would see her suggestion of a frame shift as referring to, but it has to be understood in a thoroughly radical and comprehensive sense. Thus I approach these three papers with the question, how do they fit into world history or global history properly viewed? And the few comments that I will offer form an endeavor to show that these historical episodes, as diverse as they are, do each illuminate, illustrate that transition from modernity to postmodernity. However, before addressing these three papers, and in order to further sketch a context for addressing these three papers, I refer briefly back to Jessica's and John's presentations in the opening session, and also forward to Jose Manuel's paper that will open the next session on Theodor von Karman and his work as aerodynamical theorist. Jessica, in concluding, raised the question whether the universality and disinterestedness on which scientists and social scientists, almost as much as natural scientists, prided themselves, preened themselves in the 2 decades following the Second World War. And you will recall Robert Merton's Norms of Science, in which universality and disinterestedness are central. She raised the question whether these values have survived the end of the Cold War. The implication in that question is that they at least may not, perhaps even the implication that they have not, and indeed, it seems to me, as we understood from John's presentation, these values are pervasively absent in our contemporary era. We live today in a world of bound and interested knowledge, quite the opposite of the world of universal and disinterested knowledge that science would be in modernity. Turning back to the Cold War and looking ahead to Jose Manuel's paper, I would here emphasize his emphasis on the concept of compartmentalization. The concept of compartmentalization as facilitating a grasp of the difference between that Cold War epoch and our post-Cold War, indeed post-modern, more essentially post-modern epoch. Of course, compartmentalization was an organizational mechanism or arrangement or provision of knowledge production and curation, which first found wide application in the natural sciences, at least outside commercial contexts, in Second World War programs for weapons development, and then continued as a mechanism widely used to ensure security of knowledge in the Cold War. But the compartmentalization that Jose Manuel refers to and that I would emphasize is not a social institution, but a mental mechanism. It is the compartmentalization that individual scientists, but pure scientists as they understood themselves as a class, made use of as a device to protect their senses of themselves as pure scientists, in the sense that modernity esteemed in the circumstance of their participation in military projects and programs. So we have the social device of compartmentalization, which may or may not be accompanied by the mental mechanism of compartmentalization. And in the Cold War, this was most definitely the case. The two forms of compartmentalization coexisted in our post-Cold War, postmodern era. We have, as John emphasized, a very widespread system of compartmentalization of knowledge in its production and its curation, while at the same time the persons engaged in knowledge production and curation have quite abandoned any compartmentalization of their sense of themselves, of their imagining of the relation of the work that they might do in their university laboratory and the work that has pertinence to bound and interested knowledge. To carry this down to a slightly more concrete level, I would take, as Jose Manuel will take, the issue of pure versus applied research. And compartmentalization is more specifically a mechanism for imagining that the research that one as a Cold War basic researcher in an academic setting did was quite autonomous from and independent of and conceptually uninfluenced by whatever engagements one may have either as a creator or as an advisor of militarily relevant knowledge. It would be exactly the mechanism that the members of Jason, to which Olival referred, this elite group of largely physicists, largely theoretical physicists, who would meet for some weeks during the summer to review military problems, applying their particularly effective brain grease to these technical issues, but in their own minds, that which occurred in their own laboratories, that which determined the direction of their own research, that which they published in their papers was immune from, uninfluenced by their participation in deliberations regarding technical problems. This is, of course, exactly the opposite of the situation which John was drawing attention to, and the differentiation then between academic environments and industrial research environments becomes relatively small in our contemporary era. Well, I would just draw into this Jessica's testimony of and for Merrill Tuve, an American physicist of the pre-war and Cold War era, and I will not go further because I see that I am beginning to encroach upon the limits of my own time. But let me then bring the three papers that we have heard into this orbit, this ambit. Slava's Soviet mathematicians are, we can now see, radically modern, they have placed science above all else. They have used science to distinguish themselves and separate themselves from a social, political, economic environment which is extraordinarily unsupportive and in the highest measure unsympathetic. As Slava quoted one mathematician, we live in a prison. Karen Rader's, Frank Oppenheimer is basically a modern physicist, even a modern scientific personality with a new age overlay. It was very clear that as soon as you scratched that surface, you found someone who placed science above all else. The real audience, the real function for this reconceived education was that small minority of students who might be stimulated by it to become good scientists. Where the opportunity arose to cast aside informal education and provide quite formal education for teachers, why, Frank Oppenheimer was perfectly glad to do that. Olival's case is shows something of the same mixture, but points more clearly also towards post-modernity. And there one saw the older physicists, the Franco Soleri, Teraldo di Francia. These are old leftists. They are determinists. And they want a materialistic interpretation of quantum mechanics. And then there are the Young Turks, the Tito Tonietis, the Angelo Baraccas. They want, they're not at all interested in determinism. They want to transform the way physics is done. Indeed, they want to transform the way physics is done so much that they do not stay in physics. Baracca turns to politics and passes out of physics. Tito Tonietti turns to a very individualized personal pursuit of the history of science, mainly in the form of the history of musical theory. And so what one sees there is, again, the disintegration of the scientific enterprise in the modern sense, lingering in the background of these interventions. Thank you.
I guess my question is for Simone Turchetti, University of Manchester. I guess my question is for all three of you. I really thought that the papers were extremely interesting, fascinating, new material, telling us a lot of new things. But it seems to me that all three papers focused on the practices of these individuals, as in Frank Oppenheimer and Italian physicist being nonconformist, as well as the Soviet mathematicians trying to find alternative places to meet together, socialize, and so on and so forth. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about stronger links that will link the political, cultural atmosphere of the time to their actual cultural propositions. Just a quick example and then I close. Say, for instance, in the case of the Soviet mathematicians, was there something that were suggesting that would, say, for instance, go against dialectical materialism, or, I don't know, proposing all sorts of different cultural propositions from mainstream Soviet mathematics? Thanks.
turned on.
No.
First a question. Daniele Cozzoli, Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Very short. It's just a question for Olival and maybe for Paul, as I'm very ignorant of this history of Italian physicists. Apparently, you said that the work on the foundations of quantum mechanics helped somehow to change or to anyway to renovate physics in Italy, whether the works carried out in history of physics was not very productive. But I wonder whether they was really conceived as two different tasks. And my question is also where the group by the group of Marcello Cini and Michelangelo De Maria involved in Varenna School, that did they participate to the school? Were also they involved in this? Because all them were interested in history of physics lately in the 1980s, in the 1990s. I remember that I learned of Thomas Kuhn's work when I was 16 years old, because in my school textbook of physics there was an appendix that was the textbook written by Marcello Cini, and there was in appendix a couple of pages of Kuhn's work. So this can be a sort of cultural influence.
Did you want some replies? Oh, I have a question. If you're going to take more questions. Jessica Vaughan, University of British Columbia. I was just struck in all three papers by, I think, a common theme of how under certain circumstances, contexts of political repression and deprivation become sources of creative possibility, as opposed to the situation that John Kriega outlined in the morning, in which a set of constraints becomes essentially totalitarian and able to induce compliance rather than resistance. And I guess I would ask the panel to reflect upon, the nature of the conditions that allowed the kinds of generative responses that you've identified in your work, as opposed to the kind of situation that John described in his paper this morning.
One question to Karen, another one to Slava. To Karen, could you say something about how spread this idea of exploratorium all over the world? I know that in Berlin, in the western part, it was founded an kind of exploratorium in the 80s, and maybe I think it was very early. And maybe it was not by chance, that was just on the front line of the Cold War. And to Slava, what you described, that this Dutchanization, was it restricted only for the field of mathematics, or was there a similar movement in other disciplines in the Soviet Union? And this group of Dutchanization, have you an idea how big this group was in relation to the whole mathematical community in the Soviet Union, and how strong was the control of the observation of this niche by the KGB?
I really appreciate Paul's comment about sort of Oppenheimer as a scientific personality with a New Age overlay and this connection between modernism and postmodernism boundary. I thought that was very helpful. I think in connection with the question on ideology and how it informs, as well as the question about sort of political repression as a source of creative possibility, I think Oppenheimer is a very interesting character in both those respects, and the Exploratorium is as well. There's the question of sort of how he self-identifies those things versus how those things can be read in through other means. He definitely self-identified as a scientific person, but saw himself as kind of informed to the extent that he allowed, that he was shaped by his culture. He saw the integration of art and other and cross-disciplinary work as a kind of ideological nod at the Exploratorium. But what I was trying to capture is there were limits to this. He did not see sort of politics and environmentalism and any kind of broader critique of science as something he wanted to be a part of the Exploratorium. So that's why I thought Paul's was very helpful, Paul's comments. Jessica, I think that's a really generous reading, sort of like, you know, repression as a source of creative possibility. I think it wouldn't have happened if he hadn't been kicked out. Yeah. Right. And then to the question about spread all over the world, another aspect of the archival material that I haven't done as much with because I've been so focused on kind of the life science displays and the shifts there, is there's a massive amount of correspondence with international, Africa, Korea, Berlin, right? So it internationalizes very quickly, very early on, and part of the pictures I was showing you about the watchful grasshopper come from something called an Exploratorium cookbook, which was essentially a manual for how to replicate these displays anywhere. With this, I mean, the grasshopper didn't take off for what I hope are obvious reasons. Teaching grasshopper surgery and also the kind of political dimensions of that made it non-replicatable and non-desirable to be replicated. But what I find kind of interesting about that is that it's not that the Exploratorium model develops and then it gets internationalized, but in a way what Oppenheimer is doing when he goes on that Guggenheim Fellowship, he's going to the Deutsches Museum, he's going to sort of European museums and grabbing strategies that already exist and sort of repackaging them as hands-on science education within this kind of framework of scientific ideology, science as a tool of democracy. So it kind of goes both ways. It's not just that it goes from the Exploratorium out, but his ideas are very much informed by an international conversation that's going on before the Exploratorium and continues to go on through UNESCO and these other organizations. So that's why I need to learn more about that. But I do have some archival documents I haven't gone through yet that I want to talk about when I rewrite the paper.
Okay. I also want to agree with former remarks about my specific paper. I should say that my first reading of these events was not in the frame of modern and postmodern. It was in terms of this kind of Cold War, which is also one of the formats, trend to applications, which was one of the factors to prevent the emergence of the recession foundation of quantum mechanics, because in the 50s and even in the 60s, there were no experiments, there were no new predictions, so it was considered a field very speculative. And the speculation during Cold War times for physics was not considered a good thing. In this sense, I think that these people acted against the dominant trend of the times, because they were pushing for a kind of field which was very speculative at the time. Afterwards, it became a field very strongly relating theory and experiments, and later on in the 90s, it became a field with a technological promise. But in the 60s, I think that this was kind of a counter trend in physics. Now, but I can reframe for sure these events in the terms suggested by Forman, not only with the example he took, but I would say that the very idea of the criticizing the hierarchy inside physics, the very idea of linking physics to other fields, this was not a kind of a disciplinary movement. And it was not by chance that some of the characters Paul has mentioned, they just eventually they went out of physics. And Paul is citing these two ones because probably he knows better, but I was impressed by a number of other ones. Sabatini, for instance, is today kind of a new age activist, something like that. So many of these young physicists ended outside of physics. And indeed, there were some mixed cases. For instance, Jean-Marc Lévy-Leblond, the French who was one of these people. Indeed, he became one foot on physics and the other foot on epistemology of physics, something like that. Now, the second comment. I think, yeah, what Jessica commented, I think that in this case, repression is not the best term from the Italian case, but political activism as a source of creativity. Now you are right. And I think that the best example I have of this kind of thing was not in the Varena school, was the American physicist John Clauser, which is the best example of somebody who made a kind of, so I didn't talk here about him, but he made a kind of a mix of his political motivations and the critique of quantum mechanics. And it became a successful case, one of the best experimenters in this field. And the third and the last comment about the influence of this school on history of physics, so this kind of cultural influence in general. Indeed, if I make a comparison between the two schools, I think that the school on foundations of quantum mechanics was more influential than the second one. But I must say, and I agree with your comment, that first of all, I did not make a questionnaire for the people who went to the second school dedicated to history of physics. I based my research, in this case, mainly on archival sources. But I must say that I was impressed by the number of good Italian historians of physics who were attendees, students at that school. Tini was not exactly a kind of a student, but a number of other, some of them we know as good historians today. So probably, if I go further on this direction, I can conclude, it's a guess, in the direction you suggest, that at least in some specific cases, like the Italian case, this school was very important to reinforce the field of history of physics, which apparently was not the case in other countries.
Let me very briefly address Simon's question about cultural propositions in response to political atmosphere among Soviet mathematicians, particularly with respect to dialectical materialism. I have a book about this on Soviet cybernetics, in which I specifically discuss how Soviet scientists dealt with the question of dialectical materialism, which I argue in the 1960s degenerated into essentially a language rather than a set of principles or beliefs. So in a way, accepting dialectical materialism meant speaking a specific language, essentially displaying publicly your conformity with official values. And that's something that's this particular group of mathematicians were not in a position to do in any sense. So speaking that language was something totally alien to them. Whether philosophical ideas as such, what kind of philosophical ideas they espoused is a totally different matter, because by that time, dialectical materialism didn't function as a philosophy, it functioned purely as a public rhetoric. You know, some of them, particularly Jews, found, you know, Judaism attractive. They were, you know, interested in other types of philosophies, but there is definite alienation from the official language. On Jessica's question about the repression and deprivation as a source of creativity, in what kind of conditions allowed this, I think it's a very instructive case that shows that the Soviet system actually, in some ways, left room of flexibility for people to adapt to it. Because this group of mathematicians were not the only ones kind of suffering under the Soviet system. Practically anyone in Soviet society, in one way or another, was restricted by various types of regulations or policies. Even people who honestly, you know, worked at a factory trying to fulfill government quota of production would constantly face various barriers that they couldn't overcome through official channels. That's why the Soviet system, just in order to function normally, had to rely on all sorts of informal arrangements where people would go make deals with, you know, another factory to supply parts in the sort of overcoming the official plan, but sort of supplying in exchange for some favors. So this type of shadow exchange or shadow economy existed not just in the academia, but also in a wider economy, in other fields. So the system as a whole was dependent on these informal arrangements. So in this sense, it's just mathematicians were able to take advantage of that in that particular case to reconstitute sort of quasi-institutional mechanisms to create conditions in which they essentially could run essential services for the community, education, sort of research seminars, and so forth. And on Dieter's question on whether Dachauanization phenomenon was restricted to the fields of mathematics, I think the types of informal activities that mathematicians were drawing on were not restricted to mathematics at all. The tradition of very close kind of informal ties between teachers and students exists in many other disciplines, in physics and biology. In biology, with the sort of suppression of genetics under Lysenko, biologists were able to find all sorts of, you know, informal arrangements trying to keep their tradition going, again, having these informal circles in which they would train their students, sort of lecturing in private apartments. In the case of, so when mathematicians built up these parallel social infrastructures, they didn't invent many of these forms of activity. They appropriated forms that had existed before, but they were able to develop them into a full-fledged system that supported their community. And finally, on Paul's comment about Soviet mathematicians as radically modern and sort of thinking about science as above everything else, you know, I think indeed that would apply to Soviet mathematicians working at that time in Russia. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of them who already had great reputation in the West moved to the West, taking up jobs abroad. And there, when they joined, you know, American or French or British mathematical communities, they very quickly, you know, moved to suburbs and became just regular members of the academic communities in those countries. So when that political pressure was taken off, there was no need to cling to this idealistic ethos.
Albert, would you allow me a minute too? Of course. Thank you, thank you. Again, to respond to Jessica's valuable question, which drew my attention to a link missing from my comments, which is exactly the difference in the valuation of science between, the difference in the valuation of science between the period here under discussion from the 50s to the 70s, 80s, and the period since the end of the Cold War, which, in my view, is simply incidentally the end of the Cold War. It is the period since the beginning of postmodernity. So the communities which Slava's mathematicians joined are postmodern communities, just as I surmise, he may contradict me, the mathematicians now left in the former Soviet Union are equally postmodern. There, it seems to me that the basic point lies to answer, or approach an answer to Jessica's question, the basic point lies in the underlying presuppositions and motivations of the scientific actors in that time, so that the creativity of what would appear to be quite hostile circumstances, or the creative effect of what would appear to be quite hostile circumstances, is essentially connected with modern motivations and will not have that effect in postmodernity. I might take the liberty of drawing attention to my earliest work, which dealt with physics in Germany in the immediate period immediately following the First World War, when circumstances were, from the point of view of the physicist, very unfavorable, even hostile, economic, social, ideological, cultural, and yet it was an extraordinarily productive period. It was this paradox which particularly engaged me. It is the creative result is inseparable from the presumed orientation of the scientific actors.
Slava, I note, I loved your paper, I loved all the papers, I loved your paper particularly, but I do wonder if you shouldn't inject time as a more important variable in your story. I mean, detente comes in the middle of your period, and it is striking that Macpherson comes over from the United States, and in your long quotation in your talk, which is not in your paper, you point out how he becomes totally integrated and part of and participating in this informal system. I mean, the Soviet authorities who are trying to impose the formal system are clearly aware of this. They can't be unaware of it. So it seems to me that you have anything but a rigid system. You have a rather pulsating system here. And it might be very interesting to try to understand how, depending on the particular relationships of the Soviet system with other systems in the United States, and detente in particular, how these patterns of interaction were modulated depending on the international situation, and above all, on detente.
This is Susan Lindy of the University of Pennsylvania. All I want to do is mention two themes that I see in these papers, and they're sort of relevant to Paul, but it's partly about who drops out, who disappears from the story, and how does militarization shape who stays in science and who leaves. It's not exactly a happy ending, but it's a, where do your energies go and how are they marshaled? And finally, something that I'm picking up and haven't fully developed in my own work, and it's very intriguing in Olivel's account, which is the role of history of science and its particular ideologies in the 50s and the 60s, or even into the 70s, and how are historians of science implicated in the various kinds of narratives that the technical communities have built up to explain in their efforts to understand what this means? How are historians of science, including Paul, brought in as memory makers or producers of narrative?
No prejudice was involved. I was pulling up stakes in Rochester. I moved early that summer to Berkeley to collaborate with John Heilbronn and Spencer Wirt for a year. The idea of running off to Verena, as attractive as it seemed, was really quite out of the question.
Paracelsus, Michigan. My main question is for Karen. I really enjoyed your paper, and I love the exploratorium, and I'll spare you my drug-addled teenage explorations of the exploratorium, but they're very exciting. But my question is about the democracy that's in the title and is kind of through the talk, but is not really expressed in the paper, and where does it come in? Because as somebody who's been trained in progressive education, and Chris and I both now work in exploratory, inquiry-based education coming out of this post-Sputnik moment, it's really not about a big open room with a bunch of experiments going around however you want. Progressive education is about creating a structure in which people explore and make new discoveries. And in the context of developing that ideology of progressive education in the 1930s, social psychologists were talking about a third way in between totalitarianism, which is the strict authoritarian teacher telling you, making you memorize by rote, and a sort of a laissez-faire, here's a bunch of materials, now make masks, and then the teacher leaves the room. There's a third way, which is this sort of structured thing. So how are your actors talking about democracy actually in terms of the exploratorium, and how is it developed?
I'd like to respond to John's question about the role of international relations and in the sort of detente context particularly. Indeed, this kind of very interesting developments occur in the 70s. We should realize that with the kind of softening of the Soviet international stance in the 70s with detente, comes the tightening of screws internally. Because the Soviet leaders are afraid that this softening internationally would lead to more dissent in the country. So the KGB conducts much harsher sort of persecution and surveillance of dissident activities in the 1970s that it had done in the 60s. So people are constantly harassed, arrested. I'm not talking about mathematicians, but generally about this dissenting activity. And they're essentially pushed to more and more radicalized as dissidents. So Jewish emigration is open in the early 70s. You could see it as a softening of Soviet policy, but internally this translates into very harsh discriminatory policies of denying Jews jobs in many sensitive fields, where administrators were just afraid that you would hire a Jew then emigrates, and you would get into trouble because your employee applied for immigration. And so it's a process of sort of detente on the international stage and tightening of screws internally that pushes mathematical community as well into a more kind of defensive stance.
And progressive education, I couldn't agree with you more. So the progressive education that Oppenheimer was advocating and putting into practice through the exploratorium displays was this kind of third way. I taught at Sarah Lawrence for many years, and I know firsthand the sort of possibilities of progressive education, if not constrained by the structure, don't fully teach the student, basically. And so the way that so what I'm trying to capture here is with the idea of democratization, it is a structure, and very much in those displays, there's always signage. It's not, right? It's, what do you see, what do you do, and sort of instructing. So there's a component of it that's still the kind of holdover from this is the way to do science properly, right? And this is how you interact with this. I guess Oppenheimer's idea of democratization was in part sort of teaching this methodology, teaching the kind of process-focused, even though in a way it's a kind of learning to lie, isn't it, right? Because he's bracketing the political aspects that very much affected him personally. But he's doing that, and he talks about this more in other essays, in the name of, as he sees it, giving people the tools of process so they can deconstruct, not, sort of take the claims of science for granted, but deconstruct them. But kind of going back to Paul's comment of, who is really the audience for this work? I mean, Paul's saying it as it's really still the potential scientist, the student that could become a scientist. He struggled a bit with that in his public presentation, because I do think there's an element of that that's very true. But when he presented the exploratorium, he was always giving the examples. For example, there was apparently this one woman who came in, the ceiling had been painted dark to kind of make sure there weren't shadows, inappropriate shadows in a perception exhibit with light. And she looked up and she saw light shining through the ceiling. The light had been created by a seagull that had landed on the roof of the exploratorium and scratched off the paint. But she just went in, endless. She would come to the explainers, say, what is this light about? And so he just thought that was the greatest example, because she was finding meaning in something, even in something that didn't have meaning. She was exploring, and he would talk endlessly about the woman that wrote to him about, she would come to the exploratorium, she would do the exhibit, she would go home and try to figure out how to fix a light fixture. So he was kind of trying to incorporate these examples, even though I think there's some truth in the idea, and where you say he kind of, when it comes to are we going to educate school teachers or not, he does it. So he is still speaking to the science teachers that educate future scientists, but he's trying to kind of put that in tension with a kind of ideal of accessibility of process, and also of potentially the people that could be involved in this, and not necessarily just those that would become scientists.